I grew up in North Pennsylvania in a small town called Wellsboro. It's surrounded by state game land. I don't live there anymore, but hunting season was a big deal there. Schools would even close on the first day of rifle season because half the town would be out in the woods. My dad got me into hunting when I was about 12, and by the time I was 23, I was going out alone regularly. This happened during the late archery season in November of 2021. I remember because there was already a light dusting of snow on the ground, which made it easier to track movement. I had permission to hunt a large piece of private land owned by an older guy my dad knew from work. The property was around 70 acres of thick woods with a small clearing and an old logging trail running through it. There was also an abandoned hunting cabin way back in the woods that nobody used anymore because the roof was starting to cave in. I had been there maybe 4 or 5 times before and never saw anyone else. That morning, I got there around 5:15 a.m. while it was still completely dark. I parked my truck where I always did near a rusted gate and walked in with my headlamp on. The woods were dead quiet. I remember having this weird feeling like I was being watched before I even got to the stand, but I just blamed it on being alone in the dark like always. I climbed into my tree stand about 20 feet up and waited for daylight. About an hour after sunrise, I noticed something that immediately bothered me. About 60 yards out, I saw another tree stand that had not been there before. I knew the property pretty well, and I was certain it had not been there the previous weekend. It was one of those cheap ladder stands, and it looked old and weathered, like it had been sitting somewhere for years, but I would have noticed it before. What bothered me more was that there were no footprints leading to it in the snow, except for one single trail of prints that went from deep in the woods straight to the base of the stand. I watched it for a while, thinking maybe someone else had permission to hunt there and just never mentioned it. Around 8 a.m., I saw movement near that stand. At first, thinking it was a deer, I was dead wrong when I saw it was a person standing behind a tree. He wasn't in camo. He was wearing a dirty gray hoodie and dark pants. He was still, and he was looking in my direction. I didn't know if he saw me at first, but then he slowly raised his arm and waved. I wouldn't say it was a friendly, smiley wave, more so a wave like he was just letting me know he saw me. I gave a small wave back, thinking maybe he was just another hunter who didn't have proper gear. After maybe a minute, he stepped behind the tree, and I expected him to walk away, but he didn't come out the other side. I waited and waited, but he never reappeared. I assumed he must have walked deeper into the woods, but I never heard footsteps. Around 10, I climbed down to stretch my legs and maybe still hunt a little. I walked toward where I saw him. When I got to the tree he had been standing behind, I saw that the snow around the tree was completely undisturbed, except for my own tracks walking in. There were no tracks leading away, just the same single line of footprints I saw earlier leading toward the ladder stand. I followed those prints, and they stopped right at the base of the stand. I looked up, expecting maybe he climbed it, but it was empty. The seat had a thin layer of snow on it that didn't look disturbed. That made no sense. I remember feeling my chest get tight, like something was very wrong. I decided to head back toward my own stand. On the way back, I noticed something tied to a branch at about eye level. It was a strip of orange hunting vest material tied in a knot. I was thinking maybe someone marked a trail. But then I saw another one about 15 feet away, and then another. They were tied at different heights, like someone had been marking something pretty specifically. That was the first time I considered just leaving. Around noon, I went back to my truck to eat and warm up. Nothing happened during that time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from the tree line. I almost left, but I convinced myself I was just overthinking things. I went back in around 2 p.m. to sit until dark. This is where things got bad. About an hour before sunset, I heard what sounded like slow footsteps behind me in the leaves. Too heavy and spaced out to be an animal. I turned to face them, expecting to see another hunter. About 30 yards behind my stand, I saw the same guy from earlier. This time he was closer, and I could see his face better. His beard looked patchy and dirty, and his skin looked pale like he hadn't been outside in daylight in weeks. What really bothered me was that he was smiling, but not in a normal way. He was just barely showing his teeth. He was holding something in his right hand, which at first I thought was a stick, until seeing the little yellow and black handle. It was a screwdriver. He didn't say anything. He chose to just stare me down with that half smile. I asked if he had permission to be on the property, but he didn't answer. After maybe 10 seconds of this heart-pounding stare-off, he slowly turned and walked away into the trees. That should have been the moment I left. However, I made the stupid decision to stay until shooting light ended. Right after sunset, I climbed down and started walking back fast. In that moment, I remember regretting not leaving while I still had some light in the sky. About halfway to my truck, I started noticing the orange cloth strips again, but this time they weren't just on branches. Some were tied to small sticks pushed into the ground, but the thing that genuinely scared me was one of the sticks had something hanging from it. It was a dead squirrel. It had been hung by a wire through its back legs. I may be a hunter, but I don't condone needless suffering of animals. Under the squirrel and stick, in the snow, someone had drawn a rough circle with a boot. That was the second time I seriously considered running. As I kept walking, I started noticing more of them. Not just squirrels, a rabbit, a crow, all hung the same way like markers, or maybe a threat. I started walking faster. About 100 yards from my truck, I saw something leaning against a tree that made me stop completely. It was my backpack, the one I had left in my tree stand earlier that day. I never brought it back down with me. It was zipped open, and my stuff was laid out in the snow, including my knife, my flashlight, and my extra arrows. They were all lined up neatly, like someone had taken inventory. That was the moment of realization that someone had been close enough to my stand to climb it without me knowing. I grabbed my stuff fast and jogged the rest of the way. When I got to the clearing where my truck was, I had another unexpected encounter. It was like it just didn't stop. My driver's side door was open. I know I locked it because I always do. Nothing inside looked stolen, but my registration papers were sitting on the passenger seat instead of the glove box. I got in and locked the doors, and as I started the truck, I looked in the mirror toward the tree line. There he was, standing just inside the woods, maybe 40 yards away, the guy in the hoodie. From what I could tell, he was still smiling. This time he raised his hand again, but instead of waving, he just pointed at me. Then he slowly dragged his finger across his own throat. I left so fast I spun gravel all the way back to the main road. I told the property owner what happened, and he said nobody else had permission to be there. He contacted the game commission. About 2 weeks later, he called my dad and said officers found a makeshift shelter deep on the property made from tarps and old wood. Inside, they found animal bones and stolen hunting gear from other properties. I never hunted there again. I don't hunt alone anymore either. Definitely not in grounds I'm not familiar with. Anything can happen when you're all alone out there. Yet, not actually alone. This story takes place in November of last year when I was on a hunting trip with my grandpa to Crockett, Texas. I don't really get to see my grandpa that often because he owns his own company, so when he told me he wanted to go hunting, I was more than happy to go. I will say, I personally don't like hunting, but I love to camp, and I had never been to this particular lease he was taking us to, so I figured why not? I love exploring new places. So I took a few days off from work and went down to Crockett with him. As we pulled up to the gate, I noticed there wasn't a real entryway like most places I've been to. It was just a dirt track with an iron gate on the side of a freeway. My grandpa got out of the truck to lift the gate, and then we headed down a long dirt road through the woods until we reached a clearing with an old house in the middle. While we were heading toward the house, he told me his father built it and they used it to go hunting or just relax and take a break from life. I could definitely see that. It was so peaceful inside the woods I could barely hear the cars from the freeway. It seemed like the perfect getaway for the weekend, or so I thought. After we pulled into the driveway, we unpacked the truck and cooked dinner for the night. Everything seemed normal. There were old beds where we put sheets and blankets, an old TV with a VCR, and the stove was particularly old-fashioned as well. After we finished eating, we went to sleep around 8:30 so we could wake up just before dawn to go to one of the blinds. As I started to fall asleep, I heard a scratching noise coming from one of the windows with the screen on it. I didn't think anything of it and fell asleep fairly soon after that. The next morning, my grandpa woke me up to get dressed so we could go to the blind. After we got there, we settled in and surveyed the clearing. We didn't see anything for a couple hours, so we decided to take a nap. I woke up after only being asleep a few minutes and took my binoculars to look at the tree line. The tree line was about 1.5 miles from the blind. I swear to God, I spotted someone peeking around the trees right at the edge of the woods, like they knew we were there. It was almost as if they had been watching us the whole time. I was thoroughly convinced someone was watching us, so I woke up my grandpa. He looked through his binoculars, and right then, a herd of deer came out into the clearing. He just chuckled and told me there was nothing to worry about and that it was just wildlife. I was irritated to say the least. I know what I saw, and it looked like someone, or at least something. After about 30 minutes, he shot one of the deer, and we took it back to the house to clean it and start skinning it. After we gutted the deer, it was about 3 o'clock, and we decided what we wanted for dinner, but we needed to head into town to get some supplies. So we hung the deer up and left for the store. When we got back, we saw claw and bite marks all over the animal's body. My grandpa and I just looked at each other in shock. He looked at me and said we were going on a night hunt. I asked him what for, and he told me he thought it was coyotes, but I didn't think that was the case. This didn't seem normal. After we ate, we grabbed some flashlights and our ARs and went out scouting. We were talking for a solid 45 minutes before we heard anything. We got really close to the tree line, and I suddenly turned and saw something peeking out at us again. The second it realized I noticed it, it quickly hid. I tried everything in my power not to yell for my grandpa, so I did a light whistle to him and waved him over to where I saw it. He whispered for me to stay put and watch his back. He walked into the woods with his gun raised and disappeared. I stood there for what felt like forever, waiting to hear something. After about 10 minutes, I heard a gunshot. I ran into the woods and saw a coyote with a mutilated deer next to it. I breathed a sigh of relief seeing my grandpa okay, but he told me the coyote noticed him and looked like it was about to attack, so he had no choice. We sat there for a moment before we heard rustling in the distance, followed by the most horrifying scream I've ever heard. It wasn't human, and it was definitely not any animal I recognized, but I didn't care to find out. We booked it back to the house as fast as we could while hearing intense heavy footsteps and heavy breathing coming from behind us. It felt like we would never make it back, but we did. We slammed the door shut and locked every entrance. All we heard were weird screeching sounds and breathing right outside the door. Whatever it was began to get frustrated and slammed against the door a couple times. My grandpa got tired of being scared and shot through the door a couple times. It must have heard whatever was on the other side, because it made that terrifying screech again and then ran away. As soon as we could catch our breath, I called the police and told them what happened. They were obviously skeptical of the story, but when the deputy arrived, he didn't know what to think either. We showed him everything we found. He seemed pretty unsettled by it too. Nothing ever came back from that call, but needless to say, we probably won't ever be going back to that house again. Kyle had been asking Connor and I for 2 years to go hunting with him, and we always brushed it off because neither of us really knew what we were doing, and hunting was never something I was interested in. Kyle was the kind of guy who actually knew how to do things though. He knew how to gut a deer, split wood, start a fire without lighter fluid, and somehow look comfortable sleeping on the ground. Connor and I were not those kinds of guys. We liked the idea of a hunting trip more than the reality of it. Sitting around drinking in the mountains for a weekend sounded good. Hiking miles into the woods, waking up before sunrise, and killing an animal did not. But Kyle finally talked us into it late one November. He said rifle season was open and the weather would be cold enough to keep the bugs down. He knew a spot in the mountains where he had hunted before and almost never saw anyone else. I'm being honest, he mainly convinced us with the food and beer part in the middle of the mountains. The plan was this. We would drive up Friday morning, hike in, set up camp, and spend the weekend hunting. I'm not a hunter, so I'll do my best to use hunting terms and whatever. Connor agreed to the trip because he would agree to almost anything if it sounded like a good story later. I agreed because I didn't want to be the only one still saying no, and FOMO is strong with me sometimes. We loaded Kyle's truck before sunrise and drove a few hours into the mountains. Kyle kept talking us through everything like we were in some beginner class. He showed us how to keep the rifles pointed safe, how to walk without making as much noise, what deer sign looked like, and how to spot little trails through thick woods that I never would have noticed on my own. After parking the truck at a pull-off near an old logging road, we hiked in for an annoying amount of time. Kyle said it was only a few miles. It felt like 10. By the time we got to the area he wanted, my shoulders were sore and my legs were shaking on the steeper parts. We found a flat spot near a small creek and set up camp there. Kyle did most of the work because Connor and I were honestly useless. By the time it got dark, we had the tents up, a fire going, and a little ring of logs pulled around it to sit on. That first night actually felt perfect for a while. The woods were dead quiet except for the fire popping and the creek moving over the rocks. We were drinking beers, talking about old high school stuff, and making fun of how bad Connor was at putting up a tent. It was a rare, honestly amazing moment. I remember thinking I understood why people liked this. Then, out of the blue, we heard a scream somewhere deep in the woods. We all stopped talking at once. Kyle tilted his head and listened like a dog, while Connor laughed a little and said it sounded like a woman getting murdered. Kyle said it could be a fox. He said foxes can make sounds that sound like a screaming woman. I wanted the fox thing to be true, because that scream didn't sound like a fox to me. Because it was so far away, it was easy to tell ourselves it was an animal. After about a minute or two, we started talking again, though not as relaxed as before. Every one of us kept pausing to listen, even Kyle. About 5 minutes later, the scream came again. However, this time, it was so much closer that the conversation died instantly. It sounded like it came from maybe a football field away, if that. It was loud enough that there was no joking around after that one. It sounded exactly like a woman screaming. One long scream that ended all at once. Connor stood up and stared into the dark beyond the firelight. Kyle got to his feet too. Then Connor called out, asking if someone needed help out there. I said that was a stupid thing to do, and then we all just stared into the woods and listened for an answer. Nothing came back. Kyle looked uncomfortable in a way I hadn't seen yet. He said if it was a person, they probably would have answered. Then he said we needed to kill the fire and get into the tents. He didn't say why, but it was obvious. The fire was basically a marker showing exactly where we were. We put the fire out fast and climbed into our tents with our rifles nearby. I barely slept that night. Every little noise my brain picked up on. At some point, I must have passed out anyway, because when I woke up, it was gray outside and cold enough that I didn't want to leave the sleeping bag. But when the urge to pee got too bad, I finally stepped out of the tent. Right away though, I noticed our chairs were tipped over, and one of the coolers had been turned sideways. A grocery bag with snacks in it was torn open and dragged a few feet. Kyle's backpack was lying near the fire ring when it had definitely been against a tree when we went to bed. I called for Kyle and Connor, and they both came out half awake. Kyle looked around and immediately said a bear had probably come through. That made sense. It was the easiest explanation. We hadn't hung everything properly, and there had been food smells all over camp. The weird thing was that not much was actually gone. Stuff was moved around more than it was eaten or stolen. Still, Kyle sounded confident, and I wanted a normal explanation badly enough to accept it. He said we should move camp deeper into the woods, both because of the bear and because he wanted to get closer to the area he planned to hunt that day. So we packed up and moved. The second site was farther from the creek and on a thicker patch of woods along a slope. It somehow felt a lot more isolated, even though it probably wasn't that much farther in. We hunted most of that day. Kyle split us up, but kept us within sight at first, showing us where to sit and how to watch the tree lines and openings. Connor treated the whole thing like a game at first, but by mid-afternoon, even he had settled down. There's something about sitting in the woods for hours with a rifle that changes your mood, whether you wanted to or not. Late in the day, Kyle shot a deer. It happened fast. I only heard the crack of the rifle and then Kyle yelling for us. When Connor and I got to him, the deer was down in a patch of brush about 40 yards away. It was a decent-sized buck. Seeing a dead deer up close was different than seeing one in a photo. Kyle had us drag it back to camp, which was miserable work. Once we got there, he started field dressing it and then showed us how to skin and break it down. Connor acted interested, but I could tell he was forcing it. I just felt sick. The smell was awful, and the whole thing felt brutal. Side note, I grew up an animal lover because of my parents, so the idea of me going on a hunting trip was already kinda crazy. Kyle was in his element though. He explained every part of it like he was teaching a class, and by the end, there were chunks of meat bagged in the cooler and a bloody mess off to the side that I tried not to look at. That night, we drank again, partly to celebrate, and partly because I think Connor and I needed it after helping with the deer. Kyle cut off some backstrap and cooked it over the fire. That wasn't our originally planned dinner. It was just a celebratory meal, if you'd call it that. I have to admit, it tasted good. As a surprisingly good day was coming to a fun close, the scream came back. It was distant at first, maybe even farther than that first scream the night before, but the second I heard it, I felt an uncomfortable feeling inside me. Like, this again? We all knew that sound now. Nobody said fox this time. Nobody laughed. Kyle stared off into the dark. Connor muttered that there was no way this was happening again. We waited and hoped that that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A few minutes later, the scream came again, much closer, and this time it sounded like it was moving toward us the way it had the first night. It was fully dark by then, and the firelight made everything beyond it look even blacker. I remember the feeling that whoever was making that sound could probably see us perfectly, even though we couldn't see anything at all past the trees, and that made me uncomfortable. Kyle stood up and grabbed his rifle. He was trying to act calm, but I could hear it in his voice that he cursed under his breath. Then, in this weird burst of drunk confidence, he raised the rifle and fired a few rounds into the air. Right after that, he started yelling into the woods like a maniac, trying to sound bigger and crazier than whoever was out there. Connor and I laughed, mostly because it was sudden and ridiculous, and I think because all three of us had been drinking enough that our nerves were mixed with stupid energy. But the laughter didn't last, because a moment later, the scream came again, even closer. Close enough that it sounded like it was just a few yards outside of the edge of camp, somewhere beyond the trees where the firelight stopped. Kyle stopped yelling right away. None of us said it, but I think we all realized that if it was a person, the warning shots had not scared them off. We put the fire out again, faster than the night before. Within seconds, the site was pitch black. The only light left was a weak little glow from the coals and some moonlight through the trees. We got into our tent with our rifles. I lay there wide awake, of course. I could hear little sounds from the woods, branches shifting and leaves crunching, but I couldn't tell what was real and what my mind was inventing. Then I heard footsteps, not walking, but running, fast and hard around the tents and through the campsite. Something brushed the side of my tent, like a dragging scratch, like someone running an object along the fabric as they moved past. I didn't call out for Connor or Kyle because I was terrified that it wasn't them. All I'd be doing was getting the attention of whoever was out there. Then it went completely still for the last time. That silence was the worst part. Maybe a full minute passed before that scream exploded right in the middle of the campsite. It was so loud that it didn't sound human anymore in a normal sense. I heard Connor scream from his tent. I yelled too without meaning to. Then Kyle fired a shot through the roof of his tent into the air. The blast was deafening. Right after it, I heard fast footsteps tearing off through the woods. All these sounds were so amplified, it felt like so much was going on. The footsteps got farther and farther away until I couldn't hear a thing. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then Kyle shouted, asking if we were okay. Connor answered immediately in the shaky voice I had never heard from him before. I answered too. Kyle said we were all getting into one tent and that there was no way we were staying in separate tents after that. We crawled into his tent because it was the biggest. The three of us sat there with rifles and flashlights, barely talking. At one point, Connor asked what the hell that was, and Kyle just said he didn't know, flat out. Hours passed like that. Every so often, one of us would think we heard movement and everyone would go silent again. Eventually, the adrenaline wore off enough that we all drifted off at some point. When morning came, nothing looked as bad as I expected. A couple things were knocked over outside. One of the beer cans had been stepped on. A plastic tub had been moved a few feet, but nothing was stolen. We packed up at dawn without even discussing hunting again. Nobody wanted to stay another night. We hiked back the way we came, talking more as we got closer to the truck, probably because being in motion made us feel less trapped. By the time we were on the road again, some of the fear had turned into that weird laughter people have after something bad. Connor kept doing an impression of Kyle screaming into the woods and firing into the air, like one of the Tatooine warriors from Star Wars. Even Kyle laughed. We talked about whether we should call the sheriff and report it. In the end, we didn't. Kyle said if it was really someone needing help, they would have answered us either night when we yelled back. Connor said it was probably some lunatic messing with hunters. I said it was maybe a woman on drugs or someone trying to lure people into the dark. Both of our explanations were scary, and they felt like the easy assumptions. Truth be told, who the actual knows what the explanation could have been. I got home that night exhausted and thought I would sleep good, but I woke up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat from a dream. In the dream, I was back in the woods alone, and I could see a woman standing between the trees. She was covered in blood, and she was screaming for help. And the way she looked right at me gave me chills, even now. But I couldn't move toward her. I just stood there while she screamed and screamed until I woke up. I sat on the edge of my bed breathing hard, thinking about those 2 nights in the mountains, and wondering what that dream was about, if it was my brain telling me that I subconsciously felt guilty. What sticks with me most now is the possibility that somewhere in all that, there really had been a person out there and we chose to hide from her. I still tell myself that if someone had truly needed help, they would have answered us. They would have come closer to the fire and said something. All 3 of us wonder if someone really needed help that night, or if something darker was going on.
Watch out! Get in! Watch out! Watch out! Watch out! Help! Watch out! Help!
हो गया ना ठीक
Help!
ओ चौधरी सारे मर गए गाड़ी का टायर छोड़ दिया
Watch out! Wait!
हाँ मुझे बताइए किधर है
Watch out!
बस एक मिनट
Help!
4 नंबर कौन है
Please recall me!
पहले भी कॉल करके आया चौधरी हम मेरे नाल है हुणी अगे ना
Please
जाना
recall me!
ਜੇ ਪਹਿਲੇ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਅੱਗੇ ਜਾਣ ਦੇ ਤੂੰ ਇੱਥੇ ਰਿਕਾਲ ਤੱਕ ਲੋ ਮੁਸ਼ਕਿਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਆ ਜੀ
I'm recalling a teammate. Thanks.
वेट कर ही आएगा ऊपर ना जाइए था हाँ तेरी जो ऊपर इस तरफ है
Marked a location.
मेरे पास हैं 2.
Marked a location. Play zone.
इस तरफ है.
Marked a location.
कहीं पर है इधर. एक भागा में स्टैंड की तरफ. ये वही लगा हुआ शायद. हाँ यही 2 हैं. नाम जान नहीं. आगे ही हैं वो सारे. वो जा रहा है.
Help!
वो रहा.
Watch out!
पीछे से आ गए.
Watch out!